Hi, my name's Tim Bayne, and this is the first of a series of lectures on the problem of other minds that I'm going to be recording for the Moscow Center for Consciousness Studies. Over the course of these lectures, I'm going to provide you with a guide to what philosophers and scientists have said and are currently saying about our access to the inner lives and conscious states of other creatures, not only the members of our own species, but also the members of other species. And we'll briefly touch on issues pertaining to the identification of consciousness in neural organoids and in artificial systems, such as IBM's Watson or Google's AlphaZero. My aim in this first lecture, this introductory lecture, is to develop a map of the terrain that we'll examine in subsequent lectures. I want to introduce you to some of the key concepts and to just raise some of the central questions that we'll be addressing. I won't be considering many answers to these questions. That's the task for later lectures. I should also note that a lot of what I'm going to say in this lecture is based on material that's found in chapter 11 of my book, Philosophy of Mind and Introduction, published by Routledge in 2022. I've called this series of lectures The Problems of Other Minds rather than The Problem of Other Minds, because I want to emphasize the fact that there are a number of problems pertaining to our knowledge of other conscious minds. And what I'm going to do in this lecture is identify 4 of the central problems and try and say a little bit about how they're connected to each other. The first problem concerns how we actually go about ascribing mental states, and in particular conscious states, to other agents. There is, of course, a parallel question about how we go about ascribing mental states to ourselves, how we know what experiences we're currently having, and that's called the problem of self-knowledge. I'm going to leave the problem of self-knowledge to one side here, but I just want to note in passing that there are lots of deep and difficult but important questions about how the problem of self-knowledge and the problem of other minds are related. Returning to our knowledge of other conscious agents, we're pretty sure that some entities, our fellow human beings, dogs, cats, for example, are conscious. And we're pretty sure that many entities, bricks, chairs, tables, typewriters, for example, don't have the capacity for consciousness. But there are lots of entities, birds, fish, insects, maybe very young children, that we're unsure about when it comes to consciousness, and about which there's significant debate. Just as there's uncertainty about the distribution of consciousness in the animal kingdom, there's also uncertainty about the distribution of consciousness amongst human beings. And in later lectures, we're also going to look at some of those debates. I'm going to use the phrase the psychological problem of other minds, or sometimes just the psychological problem, to refer to the question of what it is that drives our various ascriptions of consciousness. Why exactly are we willing to ascribe consciousness to, say, dogs, but not bees? Why do we think that our fellow adult human beings are conscious, but many of us have doubts about very, very young infants, or perhaps the fetus in late stages of gestation? I'm going to call this the psychological problem because it's first and foremost a question about how our minds actually work. If you like, it's akin to the question of how we are able to recognize people, how we're able to navigate from one side of a city to the other, how we're able to produce and understand language. There is a great deal of work relating to our capacity to ascribe mental states to other people, that is, mental states more generally. This is called the mind reading or mentalizing, our mind reading or mentalizing capacities. But it's not clear how much of that work speaks directly to the mechanisms that are involved in ascribing subjective experience to a creature. Arguably, much of the work on mind reading or mentalizing, theory of mind, it's also known, presupposes that one's dealing with a conscious creature, presupposes that the entity that you're focused on has conscious states. And its focus, the mind reading literature, the focus of that literature is on the question of what kinds of mental states the target individual might be in. I'm not going to focus on the psychological question, but I do want to mention it. I do want to start with it because it forms an important backdrop to some of the questions that I will be focusing on. So that's the first aspect, or the first problem of other minds, the psychological problem. The second problem of other minds focuses on whether our everyday claims to know the conscious states of other people are justified. Are they warranted? Do they amount to knowledge? Do we know what other people are thinking? Do we know what kind of conscious states they're in? Do we even know that they're conscious at all? This version of the problem of other minds has some claim to being regarded as the traditional philosophical problem of other minds. Sometimes it's known as the epistemic problem of other minds. I'm going to refer to it as the skeptical problem of other minds. I don't know whether René Descartes, the French philosopher, was the first person to raise it. I suspect not, but he was arguably him who gave it one of its canonical modern formulations in his second meditation. He refers to an example of the way in which he refers to our knowledge of minds as an example of the way in which judgments that we make go beyond the immediate evidence of the sentence. He talks about an episode in which he looks out the window and sees people, what he takes to be people, crossing a square. One would, Descartes points out, naturally say that one sees people themselves, and yet, he asks rhetorically, perhaps the objects he sees are nothing more than automatons that are carefully concealed by hats and coats. So he's raising here a skeptical knowledge of whether one can actually know whether one has warrant or justification for thinking that the objects of perception are people who have mental states, have the conscious states that one takes them to have. Now, developing Descartes' worry, a skeptic might concede that even if we do in fact see other people and not automata, there's a question about what evidence we have that other individuals have the same kind of conscious states that we have. What evidence do we have, the skeptic might ask, that the bodily responses of other people are manifestations of the same kinds of conscious experiences, same kind of conscious sensations that we have? In fact, what evidence do we even have that other people are conscious at all? In the most extreme form, the skeptical problem of other minds raises the prospect of solipsism. Perhaps I'm the only conscious individual in the world. So one challenge, arguably it's the traditional philosophical challenge of other minds, is how and on what grounds we can set solipsism to one side as a belief that's not, as a hypothesis that's not worthy to be believed, or perhaps even engaged with as a serious prospect for belief. Before moving on to the third problem of other minds, I just want to pause for a second and ask how the first two problems, the psychological problem and the skeptical problem, are related. Now, there are a number of answers you could give to this question, depending on exactly how the skeptical challenge, the skeptical problem of other minds, is understood. One way to think of the skeptic, one way to understand what the skeptic's doing, is as challenging our claim to actually have knowledge of other minds. On this way of thinking of things, the skeptic presupposes an answer to the psychological problem, presupposes an account of how we come to form beliefs about the experiences of other people, and then argues that given that answer, our ascription of consciousness to other individuals is unjustified, unwarranted, or at least doesn't generate knowledge. But there's another way of considering the skeptical challenge, which is, and that it makes no assumptions about the psychological basis of our ascriptions of consciousness. It's independent of answers to the psychological problem, but focuses instead on the idea of that arriving at justified or warranted belief about other minds is beyond us, no matter what kind of psychological mechanisms we rely on to ascribe consciousness to other individuals. That, I think, is in some ways, the more interesting version of the skeptical problem, and I think in many ways that's how the skeptical problem has been understood in philosophy, at least traditionally. That way of understanding it pulls the skeptical problem apart from the psychological problem. So the first way of understanding the skeptical problem ties these two versions of the problem of other minds together, ties the skeptical problem and the psychological problem together very closely. The second way of understanding it pulls them apart, and at least makes this skeptical problem at least somewhat independent of the psychological problem. I'm going to turn now to the third problem of other minds, what I'm going to call the scientific problem of other minds. I'm going to call it the scientific problem because it's a problem that's a real and pressing problem for the science of consciousness in the way that the skeptical problem isn't. The scientific problem is concerned with what I'm going to call contested cases. That is, cases in which there's genuine uncertainty, or at least arguably there should be genuine uncertainty about the presence of consciousness. So the skeptical problem, the problem I've just talked about just previously, is concerned with a kind of philosophical doubt that's restricted to distinctively philosophical contexts in which one's entertaining hypotheses, skeptical hypotheses, that one wouldn't ordinarily entertain in everyday life. The scientific problem of other minds, in contrast, is concerned with cases that are live issues in science, where there's real, genuine, not merely philosophical uncertainty about the distribution of consciousness. So, as I mentioned already, many of us assume that most mammals, or at least many mammals, are conscious or have the capacity for consciousness. But there's a widespread uncertainty about consciousness, or the possibility of consciousness, in non-mammalian species, for example, in human beings who aren't capable of reporting their mental states or not capable of voluntary action, and in many other cases. We'll examine some of those cases in detail in later lectures. The point to note for now is that although the scientific problem of other minds is in some sense continuous with the philosophical problem, in some sense, they're both problems that are concerned with the question of when and in what conditions it's reasonable to ascribe consciousness to another individual. The nature and context of the two problems is really quite different. The philosophical problem is concerned with justifying a series of claims that we ordinarily take for granted. That is the skeptical problem. Whereas the scientific problem is concerned with pushing back the boundaries of our scientifically based knowledge of the world. So, we've introduced three problems of other minds: the psychological problem, the skeptical problem, and the scientific problem. There's one final problem of other minds that I want to introduce, and I'm actually going to say a little bit more about it in this lecture. Later lectures will focus really on the skeptical problem and very much on the scientific problem. This one's going to focus on this fourth problem, what I'm going to refer to as the conceptual problem of other minds. Let me introduce the conceptual problem by raising a question that you may have been impatient for me to get to already, which is, what exactly do I mean by consciousness? What's this target phenomenon here? What is this thing about which we might raise skeptical problems, for example? Thus far, I've said little, in fact, pretty much nothing about what I mean by consciousness. And you might think that that's problematic, for you can't really, you might argue, consider questions about our knowledge of consciousness and our knowledge of consciousness in other creatures without first defining what we mean by consciousness. Now, I think there's something to that line of thought. I think that the demand for an account or a characterization of consciousness is well taken. It's a reasonable one. And we certainly do have to make an attempt to point to what we're talking about when we're talking about consciousness. We've got to try to avoid talking at cross purposes. And this is a perennial problem in any discussion of consciousness, that we talk past each other and that different people are talking, in fact, about different phenomena. But we also, at the same time, need to be careful about demanding too much. Daniel Dennett, the philosopher Daniel Dennett, has warned against the dangers of what he calls premature definition. That is, of thinking that we've got to rush and decide on a nailed down definition of a phenomenon prior to a full understanding of it. I think his warning is well taken. And one of the lessons from science, I would argue, is that robust, detailed definitions of a phenomenon, be that the gene, the notion of a temperature, the definition of mass, often emerge only when a mature understanding of the relevant domain is in place. So many times you don't need to begin, and we don't actually begin with a definition of a phenomenon. Definition emerges only after we've got a really good grip on what that phenomenon involves. It is, I think, a mistake to think that you need to begin with a full, comprehensive, watertight definition of something in order to study it. Still, we do need some way of locking on to consciousness. We need some way of distinguishing it from other things, other phenomena with which it might be confused. Currently, most discussions, or at least many discussions of consciousness, take their cue from Thomas Nagel's famous paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, in which Nagel equates conscious states with states that there's something it's like to be in, something it's like for the organism in question. In that paper, Nagel's at pains to emphasize that this locution, this phrase, what it's like, isn't to be understood in some sort of comparative way, as in the state that you're in is is similar to or can be usefully compared with another kind of state. Instead, Nagel emphasizes it should be understood to refer to subjectivity. The what it's likeness of a consciousness is a matter of what it's like for the subject in themselves to be in the relevant state, that there's something it's like, there's some subjective or experiential nature to that state. Now, for better or for worse, this Nagelian conception of consciousness, that is consciousness understood in terms of the phrase what its likeness, has become known as phenomenal consciousness, and it's become the central target of the science of consciousness. It's the target that I'm going to focus on here. It's the notion of consciousness that I'm going to employ here. What all phenomenal states have in common is that there's something it's like to be in them, and what distinguishes one phenomenal state from another is what it's like to be in states of that kind. So what it's like to be in the conscious state associated with tasting strawberries is different from what it's like to be in the conscious state associated with hearing a motorcycle. And both of those kinds of conscious states differ in turn from what it's like to have experienced bodily sensations such as pains and itches. Now, I said a second ago that the Nagelian conception of consciousness is the standard one for better or for worse. And why did I mean to say that why did I imply that there's good things about it and bad things about it? Well, the good thing about it is that it does, I think, enable many people to latch on to a common target. Many people find the notion helpful. They think that they've understood something, and there's general agreement amongst many people of what that thing is. At the same time, and this is the worst bit, it's not the kind of definition that could be particularly useful, that is particularly useful from a scientific point of view, right? It's doesn't focus on any functional or causal aspects of consciousness. It doesn't identify consciousness in terms of what causes it or what it in turn causes. And in that sense, it's not a conception of consciousness easily operationalized. And this is a source of perennial challenge in the science of consciousness. It's a source of frustration for many. It's very much a first-person conception of consciousness. It makes essential reference to how consciousness is manifest or appears from the first-person perspective. And it suggests that grasping the concept of consciousness requires some sort of acquaintance with consciousness itself. So, to make this point with reference to a particularly important, a much discussed aspect of consciousness, consider pain. From the perspective of this Nagelian conception of consciousness, one grasps the concept pain not by understanding its functional profile, its causal profile, its behavioral profile. Instead, one grasps the concept of pain from the first-person perspective, that is, on the basis of having pains themselves, of knowing what it's like to be in pain. So the Nagelian conception of consciousness does a few things. Not only does it point us towards the subject matter of the study of consciousness, of the science of consciousness, of the problem of other minds, it also points us towards a particular conception of what the concept of consciousness involves. And that's going to be important for many reasons when it comes to the problem of the minds. In particular, it's important to understanding what's known as the conceptual problem of other minds. Now, as Anita Avramides has pointed out in her really useful entry on the problem of other minds in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, there's disagreement about exactly what the conceptual problem of other minds involves. Not everyone would agree on how best to characterize it. But what everyone does agree is that it dates back to a number of passages in Wittgenstein's later work. In particular, the following passage from the Philosophical Investigations, where Wittgenstein says, if one has to imagine someone else's pain on the model of one's own pain, this is a none too easy thing to do. For I have to imagine pain which I do not feel on the model of the pain which I do feel. Let me read that again. If one has to imagine someone else's pain on the model of one's own, this is a none too easy thing to do, for I have to imagine pain which I do not feel on the model of pain which I do feel. Now, I suspect that there are various ways in which one can interpret or reconstruct that passage. Here's one reconstruction of what I take to be Wittgenstein's worry. I'm going to call it the inconceivability argument. Begin with the idea that grasping a psychological concept requires introspective intention to mental states of the relevant kind. For example, grasping the concept pain involves attending to one's own pains and noting that they share a distinctive quality, painfulness. But, the argument continues, if that's right, then it would be impossible to conceive of someone else's pains. That is, pains which one doesn't feel, for any such pains wouldn't have the property that one focuses on in order to acquire the concept pain. They wouldn't feel painful to you. At best, the thought is, the model of the concept of pain, this model of the concept of pain, allows one to conceive of pains, one's own pains, in someone else's body. Pains that, as it were, are mine, but happen to feel as though they're located in your legs, for example. But that's obviously a very different thing from conceiving of your pain. So the problem, in a nutshell, isn't that I can't know whether you're in pain. That's not the conceptual problem. That's really the skeptical problem. The problem, as Wittgenstein puts it on this reading, is that I can't even formulate the hypothesis that you might be in pain. I can't put that hypothesis to myself and evaluate it. For my concept of pain, given this understanding, given the conception of how concepts are formed that he's taking issue with, the concept of pain can be applied only to my own experiences. I can conceive of a pain that's located in your body, but that's not, as it were, to conceive of your pain. Now, Wittgenstein, of course, doesn't think that it's unintelligible to apply psychological concepts like pain or consciousness to other people. He takes it for granted that we can do that. He takes it for granted that it's intelligible to pose to oneself the hypothesis that someone else might be in pain, that someone else is conscious. Indeed, he takes it for granted that we can know that other people are in pain, that other people are conscious. So the argument's really intended as a reductio ad absurdum of a purely subjective, that is sort of a Nagelian or Cartesian conception of consciousness, purporting to show that if you conceive of consciousness in purely subjective terms, in terms of what it's like to be in the states in question, then it would be incoherent to apply psychological concepts, experiential concepts, to individuals other than oneself. So, since it clearly is coherent to apply those concepts to other people, Wittgenstein concludes we ought to reject that conception of what's involved in the concepts. On his account, our concepts of pain and other conscious states aren't concepts of inner states that are private experiences, and the concepts are not acquired by attending to your own phenomenology, your own experiences. Wittgenstein doesn't actually explicitly deny that there are, as it were, subjective states, subjective inner states, feelings of pain, but he does deny, seems clear, that our concepts of states like pain, consciousness refer to those states. They are instead concepts that refer to states that are essentially connected with publicly available, observable phenomena, behavior of various kinds. I think that Wittgenstein is probably right to deny that our concepts of psychological states are acquired simply by introspectively attending to their instances. Instead, it seems likely to me that picking up on the behavioral cues that accompany psychological states, for example, learning when it is and isn't appropriate to use the relevant terms, plays an important role, an essential role perhaps, in acquiring the relevant concepts. So here's one way, I'm not going to elaborate on this point, I'll just mention it, one way in which the psychological problem of other minds that I mentioned at the start is relevant to other aspects of the problem of other minds. Nonetheless, it seems to me also true that part of what is involved in having a full and adequate grasp of the concept of pain requires knowing what it's like to be in pain. And that someone who doesn't know what it's like to be in pain, has never been in pain, has no first person or subjective acquaintance with anything like a pain experience, doesn't really have a full grasp, a mature grasp of the ordinary concept of pain. And so, although I think there's something to Wittgenstein's rejection of, as it were, a traditional introspectively based account of how we form the concept of pain, I do think it's also really important and of some interest to ask whether the inconceivability argument, as I've called it, can be resisted without embracing his analysis of psychological concepts. And the answer, I think, is that it can. One of the crucial premises in his argument is that if the state feels a certain way, then it must feel a certain way to me. And I don't think there's any reason to embrace that assumption. That, I think, is where the argument goes wrong, or one way in which it goes crucially wrong. Even if the concept pain is acquired on the basis of introspective attention to one's own pains, I don't see why one couldn't intelligibly apply it to other people. All it needs, all the application needs, it seems to me, is a grasp of the distinction between one's own subjectivity and subjectivity as such. It may indeed be incoherent to suppose that a pain can feel a certain way without feeling a certain way to someone. I'm inclined to agree that that is incoherent. But it doesn't follow that the person feeling the pain must be identical to the person deploying the concept pain, to the person who has acquired the concept of pain. So where does this leave us? I've suggested that the conceptual problem of other minds, understood in the way I've just outlined, is something of a non-starter, and that it doesn't have the important implications for accounts of psychological concepts that Wittgenstein, or Wittgensteinians more generally, think that it does. Nevertheless, we certainly do need to carefully attend to the nature of our concept, or perhaps concepts of consciousness, in working our way through the problem of other minds, and I'll return to this point in later lectures. In bringing this lecture to a close, I want to mention two further issues, each of which have an important bearing on aspects of the problem of other minds. The first issue concerns the role of intentionality or representation in characterizing consciousness. Now, many theorists contrast consciousness and conscious states with intentionality and intentional states. Consciousness, they say, is a matter of there being something it's like to be in a certain state. It's a matter of subjectivity. It's a matter of experience. Whereas intentionality is a matter of the mind's directedness towards the world. And these are two distinct phenomena. I think this contrast, this implicit contrast, is present not only in Nagel's famous paper that I mentioned earlier, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, where Nagel contrasts sensations with intentional states. It's also present, perhaps in a more qualified and nuanced form, in another paper that's done a huge amount to motivate interest in phenomenal consciousness, which is Ned Block's paper on a confusion about a function of consciousness, where Block introduces the notion of phenomenal consciousness by identifying it with experience and implicitly contrasting it with propositional attitudes like belief, desire, and intention. Nagel and Block are working here within a tradition that Terry Hogan and John Teenson, the philosophers Terry Hogan and John Teenson, have referred to as separatism. According to the separatist tradition, there are basically two fundamentally distinct types of mental states: qualitative or experiential states on the one hand, and intentional states on the other. The former are defined or characterized in terms of how they feel, where the latter, intentional states, are defined in terms of what they are about, what they represent. Now, separatism's had many venerable proponents over the years. It's been incredibly influential, but it seems to me that there are lots of reasons to reject it. And of course, I'm not alone here in pushing back against it. And I should say that Nagel isn't explicitly endorsing separatism in What It's Like to Be a Bat. And although there are separatist elements in Block's work, his endorsement of it is qualified, nuanced. One reason to push back against separatism is that there are many aspects of our basic experiential situation that are shot through, that are essentially imbued with intentionality, or at least so it seems. Consider your current perceptual context. My current perceptual context involves being presented with various objects, the computer in front of me, a glass of water to the side. I can hear various sounds in my environment. All of these experiences seem to put me in touch with objects in my environment. They seem to have intentional content. They seem to represent that my world, my context is a certain way. This is true not just of vision and audition. It's true of, for example, bodily sensations, vestibular sensations. If you're on a boat, you have an experience that has a certain qualitative, a certain experiential character, but it also purports to represent your environment, or the relationship between your body and your environment on a certain way. You have an experience of your body as moving from side to side, of moving around, of your center of gravity moving, and the like. None of this is to deny that there might be some elements of experience that are purely qualitative, that don't have any intentional content, that aren't representational. Perhaps certain kinds of mood experiences have that nature. But it is to say that the problem of consciousness isn't best approached by assuming that consciousness is one thing and intentionality is another, that it's not best approached by assuming a thoroughgoing separatism from the get-go. And it suggests that that attempts to get a handle on what it might be like to be in a certain type of conscious state might be usefully approached by asking about the intentional representational situation of the organism in question. We'll come back to that point towards the end of our series of lectures. I just want to note it for here. It's an important point to reflect on. A second point that I want to make is also connected with Nagel's famous paper, What Is It Like to Be About, and his explication of the notion of consciousness in terms of what it's like to be an X. Most attention, of course, is focused on the what it's like part of that phrase. That's what I was just doing in the previous discussion when we talked about the relationship between character, experiential character, and intentional content. But we also need to consider, it's also useful to consider, the question of what can be substituted for X in the what is it like to be an X locution. What kinds of things can have conscious states? Nagel's discussion, of course, is couched in terms of organisms, bats more specifically. But we can ask whether consciousness is restricted to organisms, or whether it's possible for entities other than organisms to be conscious. Let's call the constraint that's suggested by Nagel's paper the organismic constraint, just to give it a label. I'm not going to argue for or against the organismic constraint here. Doing that, I think, would go significantly beyond the scope of what I can do in this lecture. But I do just want to mention, to draw your attention to a couple of scenarios which come into direct conversation, direct contact with the organismic constraint. That if the organismic constraint is true, then that constrains the interpretation of these scenarios. The first scenario is the split brain syndrome, also known as the commissurotomy syndrome. In this syndrome, the bundle of fibers that connects the two hemispheres of the brain to each other, the right and left hemisphere, are severed. This is done in an effort to control epileptic seizures when anti-epileptic drugs have proven to be ineffective. So to prevent the seizures from crossing from one hemisphere to another, the corpus callosum, this bundle of fibers, is severed, either partially or perhaps almost completely. Now, according to one influential view, this procedure, the split brain operation, involves splitting a single subject of experience, a single stream of consciousness that the patient might have had prior to the operation, and splitting it into two streams, creating two subjects of experience. Now, the evidence for and against this hypothesis is complicated. I'm not going to review it here. I've written and discussed this issue, the interpretation of these results elsewhere. But the basic thought is that patients seem to be aware of objects following this operation seem to be aware of objects in the left half of the visual field, and they seem to be, in some situations, aware of objects in the right half of the visual field, but not always to be aware of those two objects together in the context of a single conjoint experience that might include or subsume both sets of objects. So there's at least prima facie evidence for thinking that what we've got is two subjects of experience, one of whom is aware of objects in the left half of the visual field, one of whom is aware of objects in the right half of the visual field. And since there's only one organism, one human being, it follows that if there are two subjects of experience, as has seemed plausible to many people, then the organismic constraint must be wrong. And there are things that aren't organisms, for example, brain hemispheres, that are capable of having experiences in their own right, that are the proper subjects of ascriptions of conscious states, conscious properties. So the truth of the organismic account would have important implications for our interpretation of the split brain syndrome. Put another way, a very popular interpretation of the split brain syndrome would suggest that the organismic constraint might be false. The organismic constraint also has important implications for certain views of certain debates in the metaphysics of consciousness. Consider a position called Russellian monism, according to which the fundamental features of the physical world have at their core nature, at their intrinsic nature, consciousness, phenomenal properties, or what's sometimes called proto-phenomenal properties. So on this view, consciousness isn't just a property of human beings or other mammals. It's not even a property that's restricted to biological systems. It's a property that can be found amongst the fundamental elements of the physical world: quarks, electrons, muons, gluons, and so on. Clearly, if Russellian monism is true, or in fact any version of the kind of panpsychism that it leads to is true, then the organismic constraint is false. Put another way, if the organismic constraint is true or can be plausibly motivated, then Russellian monism and panpsychist views of consciousness more generally are in trouble. Finally, the organismic constraint is also at odds with certain forms, certain attitudes to the possibility of artificial consciousness. Some artificial entities would presumably qualify as organisms in their own right. They might have the homeostatic properties of organisms. They might maintain their boundaries. They might maintain a kind of bodily integrity in the way that organisms do. They might preserve their relationship with the environment in a kind of a homeodynamic way that's distinctive of organisms. But some artificial systems will lack any kind of, won't qualify as organisms on even the most generous or liberal conception of what it is to be an organism. So if the organismic constraint is right, then the possibility of ascribing consciousness to those sorts of entities would be ruled out from the get-go. Put another way, if one can make a plausible case for ascribing consciousness to systems like that, then the organismic constraint would be in trouble. So, as I said, I'm not going to argue for or against the organismic constraint here. Just want to draw attention to a very natural way in which one might think that the distribution of consciousness is constrained. You might think any kind of, at most, consciousness is a property that applies only to organisms. But if you were to think that, you would be making a substantive move, a substantive claim that is controversial in different ways within the literature. Let me wrap up by briefly reviewing some of the material that we've covered in this lecture. My main aim here was simply to introduce you to the problem of other minds, or really, as we've seen, the problems of other minds. I began with the psychological problem. This is the question, really a question for psychology, for neuroscience. What drives our attributions of consciousness to other creatures? Why are we inclined to ascribe consciousness to this kind of creature, but not to that kind of creature? Why are we not sure about whether consciousness might obtain over here, but we are sure that it does obtain over there? We are sure that it doesn't obtain in this kind of case. What drives our judgments about consciousness? It's a problem for psychology. It's a problem in the sciences, as it were, but it's a problem that raises some very interesting philosophical questions, some of which we've touched on here. The second problem of other minds is the traditional philosophical problem of other minds. I've called it the skeptical problem. The skeptic asks or challenges the claim that our everyday ascriptions of consciousness to other people, friends, family, colleagues, acquaintances, are justified and argues that in its straightforward form, the skeptic argues that our attributions of consciousness to other people aren't justified, that they don't amount to knowledge. The third problem of other minds that we've looked at, I've called the scientific problem of other minds. This version of the problem focuses on what I've called contested cases in which we ordinarily aren't sure about the presence or absence of consciousness. Contested cases arise in the context of our dealings with other human beings, infants, individuals suffering from severe brain damage, perhaps certain cases of anesthesia, and also in the context of considering non-human animals. Interestingly, of course, the scientific problem of other minds is increasingly raised by advances in artificial intelligence. Finally, we examined a version of the problem of other minds that's associated with the work of the later Wittgenstein, what's come to be known as the conceptual problem of other minds. And what I suggested was that although the conceptual problem as such is really a non-starter, it is, I think, a non-problem, it does draw our attention to something that's really important in any discussion of the other problems of other minds, namely the question of what exactly our concept of consciousness involves, what's built into it, what's its nature, what its structure. And as we'll see in later lectures, thinking about the epistemology of consciousness, about how our attributions of consciousness to other kinds of agents might be justified, requires careful attention to thinking about the concept of consciousness itself.